Good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast, a good morning to those on the West and Central time zones, and to those following from Europe and Israel, I want to wish you a good evening. So this coming Saturday night is Passover. It's the first Seder. And the reality is, it's one of those moments in a family's year, in a people's year. It's one of those moments that not only defines the year, but it defines our life. When you think about your memories growing up, participating in a Seder, when you think of your memories growing up, with the family, the experience, the kids preparing for the Seder, the family preparing for it. And the reality is, it's not just a story. It really is the event. It's a reenactment of the night of our liberation, the night of our independence, the night that the Jewish people became a nation. And it's an exalted evening. It's a magical night, partially because of what takes place, but partially because it shapes us, it defines us as people, as Jews. What we thought we would do for this week's briefing is specifically, I apologize about the ring in the background. What we thought we would do this particular evening is to analyze and look into the Seder, the story of the Haggadah, look into it, and see its relevance for what we're going through in our experience today in 2025. So let's go back and let's start at the beginning. The Seder does something, and the rabbis chose the text of the Seder, not is the text that you and I would have chosen if we'd been asked to create a Haggadah, if we'd been asked to create a text for a family, for a community to analyze. What would we have chosen? The story of the Exodus, the first 12, 13 chapters of the book of Exodus. That would have been our story, and that's what we would have written. But it's very interesting because the rabbis chose an area called Arami Oved Avi. It's a small section. We analyze 4 verses. It's the story of what the Jewish farmer says when the first fruits come in. And instead of eating those first fruits, they take those first fruits to Jerusalem, to the temple, and they make a declaration before God. It's a fascinating declaration because it's not, thank you for enabling this crop. Thank you for enabling my family to be able to support themselves this year. It's a declaration that goes all the way back in our history. It's a declaration of gratitude and thanks par excellence. That is the story that we tell. Why did they choose that for the Seder? Because the Seder is not a night of history. It's a night of what we call didactic history, where history is there as a vehicle. It's there as a tool to derive principles and to derive lessons. That's why they chose the story, so to speak, of gratitude par excellence. The text that the Jewish farmer would say when the first fruits were brought to Jerusalem, when he would make that declaration before God and before the Kohanim, before the priests. That's what's used. And we'll have a chance to analyze it. So what is the story? What's the background? It starts with long before the Jews come to Egypt. The Jews are a family. How do they become a family? When Jacob is sent to what today we would call Syria, Aram, where he's going to have a chance to meet his cousins, ultimately to marry 2 of his cousins, and to try to create a family. Despite the fact that Jacob's father-in-law was incredibly manipulative, Jacob was able not only to raise a family, but to do quite well financially. And when it came to a point where the jealousy, the animus against him was so significant that he spoke to his 2 wives, to Rachel and Leah, and they decided to move back to Israel. It was always their longing. It was always their yearning. That's where Jacob's parents were. Israel's the land of his destiny. And as they're leaving Syria, traveling back to Israel, Lavan's desire, his own father-in-law, was willing to eradicate his own daughters, his own grandchildren, to wipe out his own family, because he had daughters, he had daughters and grandchildren that were monotheists, that did not adopt the pagan, the polytheistic lifestyle that he had, didn't adopt his values, his way of doing business, but lived by an ethical moral code that was incredibly threatening to him. And Jacob survives that. And the reason, what does that have to do with the Haggadah? The reason it's even mentioned is that we never, as Jews, look at one experience in a vacuum. The animus that exists towards the Jewish people, because of its unique value system, its unique ethical system, its unique moral system, its unique philosophical system, its unique theological values, because of that, it generates, by definition, it generates animus. And in this case, the animus was from love. And Jacob is living in Israel. They're in the sheep herding business, the cattle business. And as a function of a famine that befalls the whole Middle East, all of North Africa, the Middle East, Jacob eventually is reunited with his son Joseph. And most of you listening, we're not going to go into the digression of Joseph, of the separation from Joseph, Joseph becoming ultimately the finance minister, the viceroy that manages the greatest economy on the globe, the Egyptian economy. But when Joseph has a rapprochement with his brothers, Joseph is reunited with his family. The reunification will be that the family is going to come down to Egypt to meet Joseph. The plan would be that Joseph would send food back to Israel, send provisions back to Israel, until the famine is over and life can continue the way that it would, or the way that it was before the famine. Well, you have a situation where God comes to Jacob as they're in the oasis that we call today the city of Beersheba. Remember, Jacob lived in Hebron, in the Judean hills. They're traveling south to Egypt. Overnight, they stay in this oasis in Beersheba on the way to Egypt. And God says, you're going to go down. God says, Jewish history is going to play itself out. That what will become a nation from your family, your small family that's barely a clan, will undergo an incredible transformation. It will be a painful transformation. It'll be a cauldron, but it will indoctrinate sociologically into the nation certain sensitivities, certain moral sensitivities, ethical sensitivities that will enable a nation to emerge from that historical experience. And Jacob goes down, and the family lives in Egypt. Joseph establishes a specific area known as Goshen. Goshen is an area where they can continue as sheep herders. It's an area that's really the first Jewish ghetto. Thousands of years before the Venetian ghetto, Joseph, the great Renaissance man himself, the man who was a sophisticated financier, the man who knows multiple languages, the man who is really a Renaissance man, understands that Egypt is not, it's not Canaan. It's not the pasture lands of Canaan that had primitive polytheistic Canaanites. Egypt is a very, very seductive society. Egypt is a sophisticated society. And there's no way that a family will be able to maintain its integrity if it's in the midst of all of that. And he establishes a unique community where the Jews can grow amongst themselves in the greater Egypt. Well, the Jews do quite well. And eventually, as the Jews start multiplying and growing it at a geometric rate, Vatimaleha Aretzosam, the Jews start spreading far and wide, long beyond the physical boundaries of Goshen. And what happens is the Jews not only grow geometrically in terms of their growth rate, their survival rate in terms of surviving infant mortality, but they grow qualitatively. They start impacting various different industries in Egypt, various different professions in Egypt, various different components of Egyptian culture. And they're incredibly successful. Now, keep in mind, the actual amount of time that the Jews live in Egypt is 210 years. The actual amount of time that the Jews suffer horrific slavery, horrific oppression, is 86 years. So keep in mind, 210 and 86. The first number of decades, the Jews did very, very well. It's the same story that we know when the Jews come to the German Rhineland. It's the same story when the Jews come to first Galicia and then eventually all of Poland. It's the same story as when the Jews come first to Andalusia, then Castile, eventually all of Spain. And it seems to be the story of American Jewry as well. We start out doing very, very well. We're appreciated. Not only do we build the community and the society around us, economically, culturally, medically, other forms, scientifically, what ends up happening is that eventually people are threatened by the success of the Jews, whether it's their educational success, whether it's their financial success, whether it's their uniqueness, their distinctiveness, and things always turn. They did in Spain, they did in Poland, they did in Germany. That's been the case. We're starting to see that in America. That was the case in Egypt. Now, in terms of how they turned, there's two possible ways that things can turn. There's two forms of anti-Semitism. One is called grassroots. An example of that would be Poland. People, Catholics, it was a religious Catholic country, and going to church every Sunday, diatribes coming from the priests about about Christ killers, about the worst crime in the history of humanity, deicide, what the Jews did to the carpenter of Nazareth, to their Lord and Savior. Now, you and I know there happen to be 4 accounts in the Gospels of the death of Jesus. 2 of them clearly say it was the Romans. One of them, it was the Romans supported by the Jews. And only one, in the case of John the Baptist, only one account does it blame the Jews for the death. But that account is the account that's been taught throughout history. And that is what was taught in Poland. And that's why, for instance, on the eve of December 25th, on Easter Sunday, Jews would literally put up their shutters, hunker down, and hope to survive the day. That was the case in Ukraine. It was a case in other parts of the world. So you have that situation where it's the population that is raised, so to speak, from its mother's milk, from its inception sociologically, to be anti-Semitic. That's not the case that we're told by the Haggadah when it came to Egypt. And I want to apologize. I'm going to define a term. Egypt is not really an accurate term. Egypt is a poor, poverty-stricken country in North Africa. For 3 decades, it lived off of Soviet foreign aid. The last 5 decades, it's lived off of American foreign aid. Mitzrayim, the term that we use in the Bible, Mitzrayim is a massive country. It's the northern third of the African continent. Mitzrayim is the whole Nile River basin. It includes today's Sudan, today's Libya, today's northwestern Africa. It was a massive, massive empire. At its time, as a function of Joseph, it was the greatest economy on the globe. And at the time, as a function of its military, the development of technology, they created something called the wooden chariot. They used the system of the wheel to use it as an implement of war. Until that time, you had a situation where war was a function of swords, knives, bows and arrows, a function of shields. The notion of the wooden chariot, the horse-drawn chariot and its rider, it changed all of warfare. So you had the most dominant military technologically, and you had the most dominant economy as a function of Joseph on the globe. It was the dominant empire. There were other countries, there were other strong countries, but no one was in the same universe. No one was in the same league as Mitzrayim, what we translate as Egypt, but is a much larger country geographically and was the dominant empire of its day. As the Jews start growing, you didn't have grassroots anti-Semitism. And that's not to say that there wasn't anti-Semitism. But in Mitzrayim, you had something called grass tops anti-Semitism. What's grass tops? Where it starts from the government. The government imposes it. The government is the initiator. The government is the catalyst. And what does the Pharaoh say? Let us deal very shrewdly. Hava nischak malo. Let us deal very shrewdly with this people. Why? Because lest this people start to grow, which they are. I apologize, I'm just getting the exact text. And what will happen if there's a war? The Jews will serve as a fifth column, and they'll drive us out of our own land. Meaning what? What the government said, Vayareu Osana, when they made us into the bad guys. They portrayed us as a fifth column. They said, look at these people. Their language is a different language. Their dress is a different dress. The Jewish dress was radically more modest than the Egyptian dress. They use different names. They use these Hebrew names. They don't use Egyptian names. They circumcise their male children. So physically, they're different than us. In other words, he pointed out all the unique, distinct characteristics of the Jews. They marry amongst their own. They socialize amongst their own. They don't come to our temples. They don't come to our houses of worship. And what happened was, he said, they're a cancer. They're no longer in Goshen. They've metastasized. They spread Vatimaleha Aritzosam. They spread throughout the length and breadth of this empire. And I'm using a term from Generalissimo Francisco Franco. It's the famous Spanish dictator. He said that the fifth column. What's a fifth column? It's an enemy within. You know, Egypt can send their soldiers and their military to the northern border to prevent Mesopotamian empires coming from whether it's Syria, Turkey, Iraq, these areas, coming in and attacking. They can send soldiers and an army to the southern border to prevent armies from Black Africa entering, which is south. In biblical terms, the term is Cush. Cush is Black Africa. Today's Eritrea, Uganda, Kenya, etc. So they can protect the border. But what would happen if there's an attack on the border? Then you have a fifth column, an enemy within, that could drive us out of our own land. This and other types of propaganda, poisoning of the country, was being driven by the government. So what they did was three phenomena. Very much like the Germans. I don't know that the Germans read the Haggadah, and I don't know that the Germans read the Bible, but the Germans intuitively did the same thing the Egyptians did. They started in 1933 with with Joseph Goebbels. What did Goebbels do? He created this ministry of propaganda. And he had as his number two, Dr. Julius Streicher. So they changed all the textbooks in school. Julius Streicher created something called the Stürmer, the stormtrooper. It was a free newspaper that was given out throughout the length and breadth of Germany. And it was propaganda. Goebbels co-opted all of the producers and directors, the equivalent of the German Hollywood, and they made propaganda films. Between the films, when you'd go to the movie theater, keep in mind that in the 1930s, people didn't have television, they didn't have iPhones. The only way you saw the news was going to the movie theater and watching the news between the double feature. Those news were propaganda. They would do experiments showing the poison that was infecting German blood by intermarrying and interbreeding with Jews, showing that the Jewish, so to speak, biology versus an Aryan biology, the nose, the gut, the spine, etc. And they would show pseudoscientific experiments equating Jews with rats, Jews with vermin. All of this was propaganda to poison the minds of the adult population, while the removal of teachers and the changing of the textbooks was propaganda within the public school system. So this is going on for years. You have Nuremberg laws. You have what's called lawfare, using the legal system to destroy the Jews. And all of this is going on for years and years to create a fertile soil, which will enable the next steps. That's exactly what happened in Mitzrayim. That's what the story of the Haggadah tells us. In the second phase, when it says Vayi'anunu, when they afflicted us, it explains what was the affliction. It wasn't slavery right away. In antiquities, you had a situation where not only did you pay financial taxes the way we do today, we have capital gains tax, we have income tax, we have real estate tax. Those are all financial taxes. But there was a labor tax, where whether it's a month a year, 6 weeks a year, you leave your family and you go and you are on the chain gang, building the roads, the highways, building dams, building ditches, building irrigation systems, building storage houses, silos to store the grain, whatever the public works may be. In the example that's given in the Haggadahs, they built these two cities like Kansas City, the Pison and Ramses. Pison and Ramses were cities where they would store the grain. They built these massive silos. What's the point? What's the point? That now there's a distinction. Egyptians no longer have to go, leave their family, leave their farm, leave their business, and go and work and do the labor tax. They can stay with their family. Let these thinking Jews, let these Jews who we brought them here, we saved them from a famine. They came to our land like leeches. They've sucked our blood. They've taken over our industries. They've taken your jobs. They've taken your businesses. They live a good life. Let them show a little gratitude. What Egyptian's going to fight that? Yeah, let the Jews leave their families for 4 or 6 or 8 weeks a year. Let them do the public works projects. And that was phase 2. What was phase 3? Vayitnu aleinu avodah kasha. Now, literally, you could translate avodah kasha as hard labor. But that's not what the Haggadah says. It says that what did the Egyptians force the Jews to do? They forced the Jews to do work bifarech. What does the word bifarech mean? A difficult word, hard to translate. So bifarech is something that breaks the psyche. I'll give you an example. There's a concept called a pircha. It's the Aramaic, another Semitic language based, similar to Hebrew. Pircha is a question in which you question the very assumptions that you were working under. See, there's different types of question. One question might be, I don't understand. Could you explain this to me? Another question is, I'm asking you, what are the facts? But then sometimes there's a question where the question is, undermining the very assumption of what you were working with. It breaks your whole assumption. What is bifarech? They forced the Jews to do work or labor that would get them to question their very existence. And what are the specifics? Men were forced to become seamstresses, tailors. Now, if you're from Poisitano or you're from Naples, if you're an Italian, that's very nice because it's an incredibly skilled talent, and many men become tailors. Think about the stitching on a ketone jacket or on a Brioni or Isaiah suit. That's a craft. That's a skill. Not in antiquities. In antiquities, women were trained with that fine motor coordination, that dexterity to be able to sew. By forcing the men to become seamstresses, they're sitting there poking themselves, making their fingers all wounded and bloody, accomplishing nothing. And what did they do with the women? They had the women doing backbreaking labor. Literally, totally inefficient. Why would you have them do backbreaking labor? Have the men do that. The men have larger shoulders. The men weigh more. The men have the ability to accomplish more in terms of slave labor. The idea was the following: to break the psyche of the Jew. Because if you accomplish nothing, if you spend your life accomplishing nothing, then you end up going into a malaise, a depression. You end up just giving up on life, not wanting to bring children into the world, not wanting to continue to live. For what? That's what the Egyptians did. It wasn't just slave labor being an economic tool. Yeah, there are certain components that were economic, but the goal in the slave labor was really the destruction of the Jewish people, to impose a depression and a malaise that would put an end to the Jews. That was their goal. And my point is, the slave labor lasted 86 years. But somewhere between the time that Jacob and the family came and settled in Goshen, in that part of Egypt, and the time that the slave labor started, there were stages. And that's what the Haggadah is spelling out. You don't go from 0 to 60 in 1 second. It's a process. It was an evil, thought out, smart, vicious process that caused great suffering of the Jews. The Jews made a false assumption, which is repeated very often in history. They said to themselves, this Pharaoh, the Pharaoh that doesn't know Joseph, this Pharaoh is a megalomaniac. He's a diabolical anti-Semite. He's obsessed with the Jews. No sense of what the Jews did for the economy. No sense that there's no more loyal citizen than the Jew. None of that. And he's a crazy man. And you know what? When he dies, the next Pharaoh will revert back to the good old policy. The philo-Semitic policy. And that's where they put all of their hopes. Guess what happened? The Haggadah tells us. The Pharaoh dies. The next Pharaoh, I wouldn't call him a philo-Semite, but he was not a diabolical anti-Semite. He made a very shrewd calculus. The fuel that runs this economy is Jewish slave labor. It's not in my interest. It's not in Mitzrayim or Egypt's interest to free or liberate these slaves. We're going to keep things the way they are. And what happened? What happened was that when the Jews realized we're going to die as slaves, our children are going to die as slaves, this is not a one-off. This is not the policy of a sicko, of a megalomaniac. This is now mainstream Egyptian existence, that they're running their economy on Jewish slave labor. At that point, they turn to God. At that point, they turn to God, and they realize they have no one else to save them. And that all of their hopes, all of their yearnings, all of their anticipations were just false, were rooted in a false reality. And what happens? At that point, when they start to go through a repentance, to go through an introspection, to go through a catharsis, at that point in time, they do start to change and realize. Start to look into their background, their history, what makes them unique. Very, very similar to some of the events that took place after October 7th. When all of the temples that Jews worshipped at, Columbia and Harvard and Brown, when all of the isms that Jews made into their religion turned on them. I remember someone said to me, a Jewish person, my Jewish life started October 8th. My religion was Black Lives Matter. I sacrificed my life for that movement. And then after October 7th, forget that there was no sympathy, they turned on me and blamed me for what happened on October 7th. I realized that, I was living a life of lies. What I worshiped, what my reality was, just wasn't true. It was a reality that I'd convinced myself was something that it wasn't. And that's what the Jews experienced. And at that point, God sends them the fugitive, Moses. Moses, the former prince of Egypt, who literally risked his life for the Jews, fled for his life, was in exile, first in Black Africa, where he served as a public servant for decades. Ultimately, later in his life, he marries a Saudi Arabian woman. He marries a woman who she was the daughter of the man named as the Kohen Midian, the former archbishop of Saudi Arabia, who himself was somewhat ostracized because he had rejected a paganistic life. He's someone who was philo-Semitic, who embraced Moses, who wanted him as a son-in-law. In the last decades, Moses was running the business. Not only was he a former archbishop, Kohen Midian, he was a member of the aristocracy. He had thousands of head of sheep and cattle. And Moses had many, many employees under his employment. And Moses encounters God, that significant prophecy, that very significant prophecy that we refer to as the burning bush. Why does the angel of God, so to speak, appear to him in a burning bush? Because tumbleweed, which is what it was, is worthless. It's wretched. You can't use it for construction purposes. You can't use it as firewood because there's not enough there to accomplish anything. It doesn't produce flowers. And that's what Moses assumed the Jews were. A bunch of wretched slaves, cantankerous, wretched slaves. And what Moses experiences is a defiance of the laws of physics. That's what attracts him to this scene. You've got a fire that's in the nucleus, and you and I know basic physics is that fire only exists when there's something to fuel the fire. When fire can consume something, it exists. What happened? The fire's in the vacuum, but it doesn't expand to the periphery, which is what should have been consumed. The tumbleweed is at the periphery. And he says, Madua lo yivar hasna. Why is it that the tumbleweed, the periphery, the wretched small area of wood, which is what should be consumed, isn't? That still exists on the periphery. But yet the fire is in the middle. The bush is not being consumed. And God's saying to him, that the reason I'm appearing to you through the angel here is that image is reflective of the Jewish people. All you see on the exterior are illiterate, in many cases, pagan slaves, primitive, illiterate pagan slaves. And if that's all there was, there's nothing to redeem. But you're making a mistake. Inside, beneath that wretched surface, beneath that coarse, ugly surface, there's a fire. There's warmth. There's still something burning. And I need you to bring that to the surface. The reason that you're being chosen is not because you're a great orator. You're not an Abba Eben. You're not a Michael Oren. You're being chosen because I've seen throughout your life your ability to care for each and every individual, your ability to mentor a people that is wretched and as coarse as they may seem. You can bring that fire from within to the surface. You can transform them into the people of the book, into a moral, ethical people, into a philosophically perfected people. You have that ability. And what I'm asking of you is to be my plenipotentiary, to be my agent, and to play that role. And Moses comes. And the people start changing. People start becoming educated. The people start preparing for a different life. And it's interesting because when the people prayed to God, this is before Moses comes, they prayed from the slave labor. But the Haggadah says the following. God didn't just hear their prayer because they were praying because they didn't want to continue. They couldn't continue that life where there's no future, there's no hope, there's no tomorrow. God saw things that they didn't pray about, but they had suffered. God saw the impact of the malaise and the depression. You know, malaise and depression, it affects the libido. It affects one's sexual drive. So when it says Vayares Anyenu, what is Anyenu? The Haggadah tells us that was the precious derech eretz. The fact that husbands and wives were not intimate with each other because there was just no drive as a function of the malaise and the depression. That it impacted the quality of family life, of married life. God saw a malaise, even though this was many, many decades ago. God saw the impact, psychological impact on these families as a function of having their their male children murdered, their male children slaughtered. He saw the impact. They had tried to suppress that pain, that hurt, those memories. But God saw the impact it had on them. And God also saw Lachatzenu, that they were almost at the point of no return, almost at a point where there was, if they had not been liberated, if they had not been brought out at that point, saved, there'd be very little left to save years later. And he brings Moses. And what does God do? God, throughout the course of this time, gives the Egyptians a chance to change. Moses' message to the Egyptians is the following. Hinei anochi horeges bechorecha. Right from the start, Moses warns the Pharaoh, warns the government, warns the leadership that the consequences of not allowing the Jews to conduct themselves like every other human being, like every other people on earth, will be the sacrifice of the firstborn. The Egyptians will lose their firstborn. And we're going to explain what was the logic, what was the method behind it. And then there's a second message that Moses is told to give to the Pharaoh. B'ni b'chori Yisrael. My child, my firstborn child, the Jewish people. B'ni b'chori Yisrael. And what does that mean? We know the Jews are not the firstborn. The Jews are not the first nation on earth. They come much later. So the point is that the role of the firstborn, And keep in mind, in antiquities, in fact, that's actually how America was developed. That's how many European nations were developed, was through primogeniture, the firstborn. What's primogeniture? That father and mother give the business, whether it's the farm, the blacksmith shop, they give the business to who? To the first child. The second, the third, the fourth child, they have to make it on their own. But so to speak, the monopoly is transferred to the firstborn. Think about America. Many cities, when you go from New York to Pennsylvania to Ohio to Michigan to Indiana to Illinois, many cities are called states. They all have a Rochester. They all have a Utica. They all have an Albany. They all have a Troy. They all have a Schenectady. I understand why they all have a Bethlehem. I understand why they all have a Jerusalem. I understand why they all have a Hebron. Because for a very simple reason. America was settled by Puritans, by religious Protestants. And they gave the biblical names. They were students of the Bible, of the Jewish Bible. And they gave biblical names to the communities they lived in. But why does every state have a Rochester, an Albany, a Utica, a Troy? Why those? And the answer is very simple, primogeniture. Just like you had in Egypt of antiquities, you had in America. The oldest son got the farm, and the younger children, go west, my child, go west. Go west, my child, go west. Meaning what? They had to go make it on their own. So they moved to virgin territory. And what did they name that virgin territory in which they settled? They named it after the town of their nativity, after the community of their nativity. If they came from Rochester, they named it Rochester. If they came from Troy, they named it Troy. If they came from Albany, they named it Albany. That's why we have those names in each and every state. That's how America was settled. That's how the westward movement of the population that settled the United States of America, that's how it happened, primogeniture. That was the case in Mitzrayim. The oldest controlled the business, whether it's a government contract, whether it is a business, whether it is a craftsman's shop, whatever it may have been, the farm. So what happened? Moses said to the Pharaoh, I understand that you alone do not control this great empire. The leadership, the power structure, the power base of this empire is based upon what? Is based upon primogeniture. It's the firstborn who control everything. They're the ones who are suppressing what should be the firstborn. What does that mean, what should be the firstborn? God's firstborn is the Jewish people. Well, we just said, historically, we're not the firstborn. What does that mean that God's firstborn is the Jewish people? The role of the firstborn, that's the one who has the influence. That's the one, younger children learn much more from the older sibling than they do from their parents. That's the one who they interact with. That's the one who's their leader. That's the one who bullies them. That's the one who shapes them. That's the one who nurtures them, who grows them. The point is that the Jew coming to Mitzrayim, the great economic society, the great scientific society, was a primitive theological society. It was a primitive philosophical society. The Jew could influence that. The Jew could shape Mitzrayim. And remember, Mitzrayim is Wimbledon Center Court. Mitzrayim, Egypt, that's Arthur Ashe Stadium. There are many different games going on in different courts. But Serena, Rafael, they only play on center court. The big games, the real games are there. What's the point? The way Egypt goes is the way the world would go. The ripple effect. Egypt was the force multiplier. If you could shape Egypt into an ethical, moral society, if you could shape Egypt into a philosophical, theological society, a healthy society, it would impact the globe. But the Egyptians, they suppressed. They squelched the Jews. The Egyptians, meaning who? The firstborn. They wouldn't allow that. They couldn't tolerate that. They couldn't tolerate that. and they suppressed and squelched the Jew. That's what happened in Mitzrayim. And God says via Moses, change. I'm giving you a chance. I'm giving you a chance to allow the Jew to play their role. That's why, what did Moses keep asking for? Martin Luther King only quoted part of the sentence. He didn't say, let my people go. He said, let my people go to the desert for a Shabbaton, for a few days, for a rendezvous where they become educated, they learn. And then those Jews were going to come back, not as slaves, come back as Jewish Egyptians, as Egyptian Jews, who, based upon what they learned, would then be able to impact and impart that knowledge and those values into Egyptian society. That was the initial goal, for the Egyptians to change and for Egypt to change. Down the road, would the Jews go to their homeland, their ancestral homeland, Israel? Absolutely, 100%. But not by just leaving Egypt, but by first and foremost impacting Egypt. Yeah, I'm sure they'd have a NAFTA free trade agreement where Egypt would be the great economic civilization, Israel would be the great intellectual, spiritual civilization, and there would be a wonderful relationship. But who prevented that? The Pharaoh and the primogeniture, the Pharaoh and the leadership. And ultimately, after all of the warnings, and we're familiar with the 10 plagues, so in the process, and it lasted over a year, as Moses is warning the leadership in Egypt, the Pharaoh and the primogeniture, the power base, they start to show the Egyptians that you ultimately have no control. The first plagues are an attack on the Egyptian value system. The Egyptians worshiped the Nile. The Nile was the great, great economic source of Egypt's bounty. It turns into a source going from being a source of life to a source of death, the blood. The second plague, it's a debate amongst the commentators. Was it frogs or was it crocodiles? The famous Spanish commentator, the Ibn Ezra, thinks that Sfardea is referring to crocodiles. Most commentators think it's frogs. So again, instead of it being a source of life and nourishment, it's a source of what? A source of pain, source of trouble. In other words, they worship the Nile. And what God was trying to show them, what Moses was trying to teach them, is that the Nile is something that is part of the physical universe that God created. And it is all, it runs, it exists at the desire, at the will of God. So their whole theology, their whole foundations are broken. Eventually, if they don't start to change, the economy is destroyed. That very economy that they insisted was necessary because it couldn't exist without Jewish slave labor, that economy, well, every component of that economy was broken. Think about the hail that destroys the crop. Think about the dever that destroys the animals. I'll come back to that. The Ebola virus, or the equivalent of the COVID virus that destroyed the animals. Think about the destruction of the crops. So primarily it's an agricultural economy. Crops, there's a huge loss. It's a devastating to this year's income. But next year, hopefully the famine will be over. Hopefully there won't be locusts next year. You can go back. What happens with dever, with the Ebola or the COVID that killed the animals? What were their animals? The Haggadah talks about the horses, the bulls, the oxen, the donkeys, the camels. The donkeys were your mid-range transportation vehicle. That's your trucks. The camels were your long-range transportation vehicle. That's the 18-wheelers. The bulls are your John Deere tractors and agricultural implements. The horses are your tanks. That's your source of war. It's also a source of travel and communication. What's the point? You can't just replace a horse. Next year we'll have a new one. No. A horse, a bull, a camel, a donkey is 4, 5, 6, 7 years old. To replace the horses, or to replace the bulls, to replace the donkeys, to replace the camels, it's 4 or 5 years. Because even if you have a calf, for that calf to grow up and now be an ox that's going to plow, you're looking at least 2.5 years. For the horse or the camel to be capable of that long transportation route that it was doing, it's again 4 or 5 years. So you haven't just devastated the short run economy, you've just devastated the long run economy. So that economy that they claimed could only exist with slave labor was just totally, step by step, ripped apart. And they came to the realization of how wrong they were. They don't control the economy. God controls the economy. And we can go on and on through all of the details. One of the purposes of the plague of darkness was that the Jews would know, number one, where the Egyptians stored their wealth, because the Jews could see during the darkness, whereas the Egyptians couldn't. The second point is those Jews who had no interest in being part of destiny, a destiny that would change the world. Many of those Jews died during that period. They didn't want the Egyptians shouldn't see Jews bearing their own. And you have a situation where the Jews are bearing their own. The Egyptians don't see it. The Jews see where there's wealth. Why is that crucial? Because when the Jews leave, it's crucial that there are reparations. You can't take back 86 years of slavery. You can't take back the fact that in the first generation there was a killing of male children. There's no way you can have compensation for that. But what you can do is that when they leave, very much like the Eichmann trial, it was very important to see that the very oppressors acknowledged their evil, acknowledged their wrong, were brought to justice. And that's what happened through the reparations. When they were told, God insisted to Moses, to the leadership, that the people ask for some form of reparation. It's not complete reparation. There's no way it can make up for all those decades and decades of slave slavery and slave labor and punishment. Can't make up for that. But there has to be an acknowledgement by the very perpetrators and oppressors of what they did was wrong. And again, there's a purpose for each and every, there's a method to the 10 plagues. But the ultimate plague, the one that was warned from the very start, the killing of the firstborn, that's the measure for measure. Because it wasn't every Egyptian that enslaved the Jews. It was the leadership. It was the power base that enslaved. It was the state apparatus, meaning the power base, that enslaved the Jews. And the very power base that refused to liberate the Jews, measure for measure, they're going to pay. They're the ones who died, not the Egyptians, not the rank and file Egyptian, but the very power base that enslaved the Jews, the primogenitor, the firstborn. And what's very crucial is, how did the Jews spend their night of liberation? Not the way that the French did. Think about who was worse. By far, the revolutionaries in France, with the guillotine, with their slaughter, their raping, their pillaging of Catholic priests and nuns, what they did to anyone who was associated with Louis XVI and with Marie Antoinette. Their evil was far worse than that perpetrated. And I'm not looking to defend Marie or Louis XVI. The same thing is true with the Bolshevik Revolution. What the communists did was far worse. The evil they perpetrated under communism, socialism, was far worse than anything that the Tsars did. And the Tsars, the Romanov family, was evil. They were horrific. They were terrible. But it was child's play what they did compared to the communists. And that should never be the definition of what marks the Jewish revolution, the Jewish liberation, the Jewish independence. You know, the King Solomon in the book of Mishlei, in the book of Proverbs, he says, Al shlosha rugza aretz. There are three phenomena that cause the earth to tremble, the world to tremble. It's a conceptual idea. One of them is al eved sheyimloch, when the slave becomes the master. We all know the story of the abused child becoming the abusive parent, the abused employee becoming the abusive employer. What happened the night of our liberation? It says, Al yetze ish mimakama. The Jews were told, Moses, on behalf of God, tells the Jews, no one leave your home. This is a night when you invite your neighbor over. It's a night of chesed. You're a former slave. Now you're able to acquire a lamb. You're going to roast this lamb. Why the roasting of the lamb? The Egyptians deified the lamb. And they'll smell that roasted lamb wafting in the air, you know, and they'll see that the Jews are showing that this is nothing more than any other animal. There's no deification. There are no powers in such an animal. Again, very much like what the first plagues did to the Nile River. That's what the Jews do to the lamb the night of the Seder. And what do you do with that roasted lamb? You invite others to come over. And you have a night of learning, a night of gratitude, a night of thanks, that after this very, very oppressive, difficult time, this time of suffering, we have a better future. We have a tomorrow. And that's what we do. We relive and we re-experience that night of gratitude. The same bitter herbs to remember what we had undergone. The same matzah. And the matzah has two components. One is it's the bread of freedom, because they didn't have time that day. The Egyptians just pushed us, leave. You know, it's saying Yiddish, geh gesinnt hey, leave, go. You know, there wasn't time to bake and make provisions. So you had unleavened bread. But also the matzah was the matzah of slavery as well. Because think about it, a slave doesn't have time. They have limited amount of fuel, of wood to burn. All they can do is just they have to put right away, before it has a chance to rise and leaven and to expand, it gets baked right away, because there's limited baking fuel, limited fuel to bake the bread. So they're both components of that. Keep in mind that the lamb, we explained what that is. So that so to speak, that wrap of the unleavened bread around the bitter herb, around the roasted lamb, with all of its meaning and symbolism. That was what took place that night. But it was a night of gratitude. It was a night of Hallel and Hodah. And it was a night of looking to the future, of raising their children and giving their children a better life than they had. And that's what we reenact. We take the section from the Jewish farmer who brings his first fruit to Jerusalem, to the temple, because it's a night of gratitude. We would have become assimilated out. We would have assimilated amongst many other illiterate pagans. We would have never been given a life of substance, a life of meaning, a life of destiny, a life of morality, a life of values, had it not been for our liberation. And the purpose of that liberation was not to be free. Again, not to attack Martin Luther King, but he got it wrong. The goal is not free at last. The goal is not let my people go. The goal was that Moses would take the people to the very place he encountered God, Mount Sinai. They would adopt a system, a philosophical, ethical system, a system of perfected ethical monotheism. And they would create a society in the land of Israel, in their ancestral homeland, that very linchpin between the three continents, between Africa, Asia, and Europe. And from that crucial geographic location, by creating an ethical moral society, by creating a theological, philosophical society, rooted in reality, rooted in principles of meaning, of substance, as a society, they would be able to impact the family of nations, impact the destiny of humanity. And we talk about that with our kids. And that's, we relive the experience of the pain, of the suffering. But we also relive the experience of the liberation. of the exaltation, the jubilation that we experienced with our liberation. And we understand that the purpose was not to be free. The purpose was to lead a purpose-driven life, a mission-driven life, a values-driven life. And the responsibility that that liberation, that freedom entailed, encompassed, the responsibility, first and foremost, to ourselves and to the next generation, to raise thoughtful Jewish children, educated Jewish children, engaged Jewish children. But for what purpose? Not just for ourselves, but ultimately for the purpose of the transformation of the destiny of humanity, to impact the world. And it's a night when we say the Hallel. It's a night when we say Psalm 136. It's a night when we sing Dayenu. We express our gratitude for this incredible opportunity to lead a meaningful life, to lead a life of substance, of education, a purpose, a meaningful driven life, a life of values. And we reflect upon our liberation, our birth, our independence. We reflect upon our purpose. We reflect upon the covenant and what was the purpose of that liberation. But we do it from a modality where we re-experience our history, we relive our history, and we express our gratitude for every single step of the way, our gratitude for every component that God gave us and that enabled us to have the blessings and the opportunities that we have today. It's a tough time. It's not an easy time for Israel. It's not an easy time to be a Jew. But I'll tell you this, the opportunities that we have today with the state of Israel, for the first time in 2,200 years, having our own, God gave us the ability to defend ourselves, having an IDF. Having these opportunities and these blessings, none of us would ever trade our lot for 1941 or for 1943. None of us would ever trade our lot for our ancestors in Latvia, Lithuania, the Ukraine, Poland, Germany. None of us would ever do that. And for the Sephardic Jews, no one would trade their lot for what life was like in 1948 in Morocco, in Iraq, in Tunisia, in Egypt. It's a challenging world we have. It's a very challenging world. But it's a world we have incredible opportunities. And it's a world that we've seen miracles, our own miracles, over the course of the last year, whether in Lebanon, in Syria, and other parts. And as we reflect this coming Saturday night, as we study this coming Saturday night, as we engage our children and our grandchildren to lead a life of meaning, to take that gift of liberation, of independence, to take the gift of the richness of the Torah, the greatest gift that God has given us. We look forward to building a better Israel, a better Jewish people, but we look forward to building a better world. Because that beacon of light, that beacon of morality, that beacon of decency that we call the Jewish homeland, that we call Israel, that light, no matter how hard Iran and its 8 proxies try to suppress it, that light shines through. And that light shines through in a way that will change the world. Just like they tried to suppress us, just like they tried to deny us and destroy us in Egypt, they're still trying to do that. The Haggadah says, B'chol dor vador omdim aleinu l'chaloseinu. In each and every generation, it's not just Egypt. It takes on different names, different manifestations, but in each and every generation, they try to do that. And in the end, ultimately, the Jewish people, the values that God gave the Jewish people, ultimately that light will shine brighter and brighter, and it will never be suppressed. I want to wish each and every one of you a meaningful year. I want to wish each and every one of you a very powerful, meaningful holiday. A holiday of learning, of growth, a holiday of family bonding, and a holiday of liberation. We have this tradition. B'Nisan Nigalu, in the month of Nisan, the Jews were redeemed. U'v'Nisan, in the month of Nisan, in the future, please God, will be the ultimate redemption. And we hope that this is the year of that ultimate redemption. Wishing you a very powerful, a very meaningful Passover, a very powerful and a very meaningful Seder and Haggadah experience. Thank you.